Also,
And
this is actually an interesting thing about AI. Believe it or not, the journals in AI, well, there basically aren't any journals in AI, but
okay.
even if you look at the very top quality journals like Nature, right, they have retraction rates that are like 40, 50% for AI,
Yeah.
which is like, it's like makes you want to barf, right?
Mm.
So it's actually, it's highly conference driven, which is really interesting.
Okay.
It's almost all open publishing, partially because actually there's not, the universities in the US, like, unfortunately, are not very good at AI for a couple of reasons, just like on average. And you actually see in the US much more of the research is coming out of private industry labs, which is weird. It's got its pluses and minuses, but one of the pluses is that it means everyone is doing open publication, and so just everything is on archive, and like Elsevier is basically a non-issue, which is kind of cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I don't know. It's a weird situation. Part of it is just like AI is like a really, really weird kind of a space.
Well, are there specific areas, someone might be listening right now that can help you
Yeah.
out? Are there specific areas that you are trying to dig deeper on that you need help
Oh
with?
yeah, it's a geometric deep learning, multimodal fusion, and machine teaching.
I've never
All
heard
which
of.
are fields that debatably exist.
Yeah. I've
Yeah.
never heard of these things before. So that's
Yeah, I
neat.
mean, I'm happy to give you like the whirlwind. I think they're like awesome,
Yeah.
frankly.
What are the each of, like, what are
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah. So machine teaching, as like a contrast to machine learning, is this really interesting notion that if you look at traditional machine learning objectives, right, people will constrain things pretty heavily, like, oh, it's a classification task or like a data extraction task or something
Mhm.
like that. And the problem is that that actually matches human experience very poorly. So one really good example of this might be something like you've got a Twitter, right, and you're trying to do binary sentiment classification, right? So that's a really classic ML task. Now, obviously, if I've got a tweet that says like the battery is good, but the screen sucks, I can't really classify that as positive or negative, right? No matter how many people I have classify that, right, there's going to be some irreducible fuzziness to it. So machine teaching is really, really roughly this idea that what if instead of, just classification tasks and sort of these really, really constrained problem framings that we've had in the past, if there's a way we could change our objective functions to more closely match the way that humans teach one another. So it's, I think one example of where this was applied, it was a really interesting place where OpenAI actually applied it to the task of summarization. Now, summarization is tough, but one of the toughest things about summarization is understanding which summary is better than which other summary. And so, it's like a very crude, almost brute force approach, right? But it is still machine teaching. Is OpenAI is just like, all right, well, we're just going to generate two, put them in front of a person, and a human is really good at saying like this summary is better than that summary, even if they can't say this is the perfect summary or this is the worst summary. So we'll just have them do that. And they had to change a lot of things, without getting too far into the details on the model on the back end to make it work with that target of like this is better than that. But that's a really good example of machine teaching, and then it led to a model that was like just insanely good and summarized things really, really well. So that's one I just think like really cool, like amazing area of research. Microsoft came up with the term machine teaching, maybe 18 months ago, or I don't know, maybe it's been a little longer than that. Multimodal fusion, also super, super interesting. So traditionally in AI, you've got like NLP that deals with text. You've got computer vision that deals with image, right? You've got, structured data techniques and like, boosting for structured data, right? And never these techniques shall meet, right? They're just like totally separate fields of study, getting to that earlier siloing point. And the idea of multimodal fusion is really roughly, and we use it in documents, so I'll use that example quickly, but it's the idea of being able to reason across different data modalities. And one of the, actually a good example I'll give on why this is so impactful, like think about drinking a glass of water, right?
Right.
Extremely simple, right? I barely have to think about it. But think about all the systems that had to come together in my body to do that, right? I've got to like feel my arm, I've got to feel the weight, I've got to balance it, right? I have to like know what temperature it is just to make sure it's not too hot or whatever, right? Now, try to imagine doing that same problem, but as a purely visual task, right? So your arm is completely numb. You've got no sense of taste, you've got no sense of temperature, you've got no sense of, any of this. And you could still probably do it, right? Like I'd probably, would visually check and, kind of start looking very robotic, right? And you see how you take a problem that was incredibly simple and you've made it almost impossibly difficult by constraining your data modality, right? And so the idea is this is, the next stage for a lot of ML techniques, right? Is learning to combine these different modalities. One good example is OpenAI's DALL-E that goes between text and image. So it's like image captioning and vice versa. So you can like type something, it'll generate a coherent image. That's multimodal translation, which makes sense, translate from image to text. And multimodal fusion, documents are a really good example, where if you think about a table, there is the literal, stuff that might be in the table, but the visual layout is also really, really important. Or if you think about logos or visual styling and things like that, right? It actually turns out that you have to interpret across those two different data modalities for a lot of really important document tasks. And so that's one example of where you've got to fuse the two different modalities, right, of text and image, right, to get to your final conclusion. Video is, another really good example. Computationally, we're not quite at the point where we can do video. But so that's multimodal fusion in a nutshell. And then geometric deep learning is just very roughly is deep learning plus very complicated math. Specifically, differential geometry there is sort of based on a couple of interesting notions, but one that I find really interesting is like, what is language and what are words? And one example of something that's really weird, you think about mouse, right? And there's a traditional field in ML called sort of a representation learning or transfer learning or something along those lines. And so the idea is, you'd have the word mouse and you learn some definition for mouse, right? And that'll be like a 200 dimensional on vector, or just a list of 200 numbers. And then you think immediately, okay, great. So now I've got some meaning for the word mouse, but I've got multiple different kinds of mouse, right? So I've got computer mouse and I've got animal mouse. What do I do, right? Like, what's the right analogy for that? And so the immediate one that people think about is like, well, I'll learn two different vectors, like I'll learn two different representations, right? And I'll just figure out which mouse I mean, and then I'll use the right definition at the right time. And it turns out that's actually not quite right, which is sort of weird. And you can think about these because these are two different vectors, like two different positions in space. So it's actually not the case, or it doesn't seem to be the case based on current research, right? That you have two different locations for the two different definitions of mouse. It's actually much more that you have one central locus, right? That is mouse in all of its incarnations. And the definition you're using is more about the direction that you pass through it, right? So it's like maybe this direction is like computer mouse and this direction is animal mouse. And again, without going like too far down into the details, that kind of analogy and that kind of like really weird geometric kind of trying to twin sort of the analogies that we use in combining language and understanding how words relate to each other and trying to get sort of geometrical mathematical formalisms that you can twin with those. So yeah, sorry, take a deep breath, but those are kind of the three areas that I'm